philosophy. And Rousseau's philosophy, incidentally, after the French Revolution, was imposed on France. And it was Rousseau who believed in this innocent childhood and this, the noble savage. And Mozart was an experiment. He was an experiment.
Oh.
He was illusion, the creation of a musical Superman. Yeah? The creation of a musical Superman brought to its maximum extent by traversing the Holy Roman Empire, as Maria Theresa said, like a beggar. Yeah? Going from court to... Now, if you ask yourself, how could Leopold Mozart, his father, have arranged 7 years of touring across Europe? Can you imagine the logistics of that? And he himself was nothing more than a violinist. In fact, he had studied philosophy at the University of Salzburg. Mm-hmm. He was no great musician also. He rose to a position of vice Kapellmeister, which is nothing significant. Where did he find the time as a working class man, as a middle class man at best, to write this voluminous correspondence to potentates, princes, archbishops, patrons, all across Europe, for a total span of 7 years of touring? And how is it that Mozart never went to school in his entire life? I mean, we really must question who is being exploited here. Mozart, as a child, was brought up to be unchallenged, if you like. He was never really challenged until, surprisingly, he came to Vienna as a 12-year-old child in 1768, after his tours of accommodating patrons in Italy, France, England, and so forth. But in 1768, when he arrived in Vienna, to their surprise, and he was accompanied by his father, the Viennese, and you can see it in the correspondence, the Mozart correspondence, the Viennese didn't believe in the Mozart roadshow. They didn't believe it. Mm-hmm. They challenged him. For the very first time, Leopold Mozart was challenged on his son's musical abilities, and Leopold was so upset with this that he managed to obtain an appointment with the emperor, saying at that meeting, "How is it that my son has traveled all across Europe, but nobody here in Vienna believes in him?" Mm-hmm. You know, in England they welcomed him, he said, they welcomed him as a genius. But why is it that even the Austrian people can't accept? And out of this embarrassing meeting came a commission for young Wolfgang to write an opera, which 4 months later they brought back to Vienna from Salzburg. But it was immediately noticed that this opera had been ghost-written. The young boy didn't know anything about it at all. And the opera was abandoned. The name of the opera was La Finta Semplice. La Finta Semplice was supposed to have been paid for by the Empress and the Emperor, but it was such an embarrassing fiasco that it was cancelled, and they were not paid. There's no record of any payment, and they went back to Vienna, and finally their Jesuit friends in Vienna staged it once only in 1769. This is the truth of Mozart, unlike the fairy story. And this continued. It continued and continued until Mozart finally arrived in 1781 with the mythical story of his break from service with Salzburg, with Archbishop Colloredo, and he became a freelance composer. At least that's what the story says. Mm-hmm. But the reality is very different.
And you mentioned Mozart as a kind of an experiment, as a music superman, in that sense that they were trying to create this musical genius in that sense. But I guess also then that means that it was a failed experiment, and it was all about the perception of the man and not really actually what he was able or capable of doing. Is that right?
That is correct. In order to achieve this task, you would have needed a group of composers who were supplying this music. Who were the true composers of this music? Well, if I give you a few names, let's see if you are aware of them. Mm-hmm. One of them is Van Hal. Vanhal.
Nope.
Van Hal. Okay, Van Hal is unknown today, highly suppressed. He was virtually a next-door neighbor of Vienna, of Mozart throughout his Vienna career. Van Hal was a great composer, and Van Hal's music stops at the moment when Mozart arrived in town. Van Hal, if you check out, he was a great composer from Bohemia. Another one I might just mention, and this is now well known, was Joseph Myslivacek. Another Bohemian composer, Joseph Myslivacek.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote many symphonies and sonatas, which are today still attributed to Mozart. Joseph Myslivacek. In fact, Joseph Myslivacek is mentioned more in the Mozart correspondence than any other composer. And yet today, if you ask about Joseph who? That's right. Joseph Myslivacek.
And tell us just a little briefly about this, the Mozart correspondence. Is that a book compiled of letters and so forth, or what is that?
The Mozart correspondence is the voluminous exchange of letters between Leopold, Mozart, Wolfgang, Leopold, Nan Earl, Leopold, etc. The family correspondence.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, in the 18th century, it was expensive to write letters. Ordinary people didn't usually do this. But we are asked to believe that the Mozart family carried on this huge correspondence. They had no time for anything else except mountains of correspondence. So that today we have hundreds and hundreds. But the strange thing about the Mozart correspondence, if you look at the last 10 years of Mozart's life, there are hundreds of letters from him to various people. But there is not one single letter to him from his entire Viennese career, 1781 to 1791. Not a single letter has survived. Not one.
Okay.
That's a strange fact. No?
Yeah, that sure is. Why do you think that is then? Because he simply didn't get any, right? Or what? Because
the entire career of Mozart is being staged, managed.
Yes.
That's why.
But you don't. This is not about like the guy never existed or anything like that. This is more like he was working within music, are you saying? But he wasn't that big of a deal really when it comes to composing, and he wasn't certainly not a genius, but he was around at that period. Do you think still?
He was playing a role. Mozart was really an actor.
Okay.
He was a person who went through the motions. It would bring glory. He had been persuaded that this was in the best interests of the status quo, the people who controlled him, that they would bring glory to Vienna. They would bring. This happened later with Beethoven to some extent. You shouldn't do another program on that one, but Mozart. Mozart by this time was so used to lying, and his family. His father died in 1787, 4 years before he died. But Mozart was so used to the falsification, so supported by other musicians, that to him it was perfectly normal. And these things were further concealed by the early biographies written by Němeček in Prague in 1797, highly suppressed. They destroyed the first edition of this biography, by the way. And the second biography was written by his widow, Constanze Mozart, in Denmark in 1827. Mm-hmm. And this too is full of errors and falsifications. So on these two foundations, the entire Mozart mythology was built. Plus, of course, the posthumous publication of works that nobody had ever heard of. They suddenly started pouring out of the tap. There were hundreds, or there were 500 or so works published after his death, which made up the main part of the myth that we know today as Mozart.
Do you think that those pieces were actually also even written after his death, or were they just written by someone else during his time and then brought out later, or where do you think they came from?
A combination of both. Many were written after his death, but some were revised and completely rewritten, reorchestrated by his patrons.
And
yes,
you mentioned before also the importance here, so to speak, of the Holy Roman Empire being behind this, the emperor
yeah.
in Vienna and so forth. Because I'm a little bit uncertain in regards to time frame here. Is this the Habsburg dynasty that we're talking about, or what dynasty do you know which is involved in this?
And surprisingly, the emperor at that time, Joseph II, was a good man. He was not involved in this nonsense, but other members of his family were, such as Max Franz, who is his younger brother. His younger brother became the elector of Cologne, or the elector at Bonn in 1784. He was one of the principal patrons of Mozart's career. You must remember that Austria had suffered setback after setback militarily in the 18th century. They had no musical geniuses in German-speaking musical geniuses, so they were all Italian. All the Kapellmeisters were Italian. They were Bohemians, they were Italians, but where were the Germans? And so they have to create the illusion, the impression with Joseph Haydn, then later with Mozart, and finally with Beethoven, that there is an indigenous German genius. Not only this, but this indigenous German genius is worthy of being used to create the idea of Vienna as the city of music. And as for history, or where the symphony comes from, where the music actually comes from, well, that was easily suppressed over the next century.
You know, just to put this into context also for people listening, many researchers have been talking about the manipulation behind the 60s, for example, about how many artist rock groups have been composed. And again, we only have to think of what's going on today in regards to, in many cases, there isn't really a skill behind many of the artists that we see, on the MTV or here on the radio, what have you. These are constructions that are put together. It's a combination of a nice looking face and another one's voice. Maybe we don't exactly know how everything happens here, so to speak, but there's a lot of tricks going on in order to kind of basically fool people into believing that, wow, what a talent, he or she's, good looking, yada, yada, all this stuff. And what you're describing here is a similar thing, but probably one of the first examples of this taking place in history, right?
Absolutely. This is so correct. This is, I can't stress enough how correct that is. It is the movie industry of the 18th, well, it's show business of the 18th century.
There you go.
In a time when there was no copyright, in a time when composers really couldn't earn a living and would do anything to, but the publishers of the 18th century in Vienna, these people were party to what was happening. Of course they were. But I also want to stress that the Illuminati, by the 1780s, which were really an offshoot of the Jesuits. And I have to say this because the Jesuits were the schoolmasters, they were the confessors of kings right across the Holy Roman Empire. They educated Leopold Mozart. Out of the suppression of the Jesuits, as you know, came many things. And one of them was the end of their monopoly on the book industry, the book publishing industry. Until 1773, the Jesuits controlled publishing completely. They controlled music publishing. They vetted every book that was published. But in 1773, they were forced to go underground, and they re-emerged as they did in the Renaissance through Rosicrucianism, later through the Freemasons.